Welcome to the latest episode in Leadership and Culture in Healthcare, a weekly podcast. I'm Matthew Wynn, the host of our podcast, and I'm delighted that I am with Graham Wareham. Graham, why don't you explain a little bit about you and where you work and what you do, just so people can get a sense of the other person on the mic.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, my name's Graham Wareham. I'm Chief Executive at Surrey and Borders NHS Partnership Foundation Trust, and we're a mental health trust. We deliver a broad range of mental health services, including inpatient services, community services, drug and alcohol services, and learning disability, NHS and social care services. And there's probably a number of others that I could carry on listing, but I will stop there in terms of the range of our offer. You wanted me to talk a bit about myself, I think, is that right?
Yeah, dude. I mean, how long have you been doing the job, and what kind of what led you to become the chief exec of the organisation? That would be interesting.
Yes, that's actually a very good question,
Okay.
which I might come to a bit. But just a brief about how I sort of arrived here. I'm an accountant by training. I started off in the commercial sector, working at British Airways and a food retailer called Safeway. I went on to work in the charity sector with an organisation called Leonard Cheshire, who ran care homes for people with a physical disability and a learning disability. And I guess it was when I was at Leonard Cheshire that my interest in the NHS started, because we at Leonard Cheshire, they used to do a lot of work with the NHS, and I was really interested about the overlaps and saw the NHS as a real opportunity to kind of really improve people's experiences. And so I started looking about how I could make a move from the charity sector into the NHS sector, which is actually, I think, relatively difficult, would be my reflections. And so it took me a good few years of building networks, understanding the NHS better. And I joined Surrey and Borders in 2015 as Chief Finance Officer. I spent a number of years here as just the Chief Finance Officer, and then in conversations with my chief executive at the time, who was Fiona Edwards, we talked about where my career was going and whether I would continue doing finance and whether I should go off and join an acute trust to be a chief finance officer, or whether my career lay in a different path. And that conversation really got me into a space of, I was very interested and always have been, in what is the organisation doing, how is it making people's lives better. And Fiona at that time said, well, that sounds like the right questions that a chief exec wants the answers to. I really think you should think about being my deputy chief exec, see how you find it. And, you can take it from there. So that's exactly what happened. I became the deputy chief exec at Surrey and Borders. I did that for, I think, about a year. And this was at this time, obviously, the NHS was just reorganising. So ICBs were just being created. Fiona was already a leader at the Frimley system, and she started doing 2 days a week. And so then that meant my deputy chief exec role really changed, because I started to step up and really see the role of chief exec in a much clearer sight. And then Fiona was seconded for a year, so I was the acting chief executive. And then Fiona was successful in her job of being the chief exec from the ICB, and I applied to be the substantive chief exec at Surrey and Borders, and that's what I did achieve about 2 years ago. So
that's quite a journey, isn't it?
Yes,
to get there. And I'm intrigued, because we've on this series 1 of podcasts, I've had people from all kinds of backgrounds. You're the second accountant who have become a chief exec, and you talk there about getting interested in the dynamics, the change, the human elements. Had that been part of your interest at your previous jobs in Leonard Cheshire and elsewhere, or is it just the new context gave you a different kind of look?
I think I always thought, as an accountant or a finance professional, to be a good finance professional, you need to know your business, if you like. So whether my business was that of aeroplanes, food retail, running care homes, or mental health and learning disability services, I've always wanted to understand it, because I thought it was really important to being a good finance professional. However, I think where I also got to was it wasn't really quite satisfying enough to just know your business so you could be a good finance professional. I actually wanted to make things run better. I wanted things to work better. So that kind of, I guess, frustration that I couldn't do everything I wanted to do is what led that conversation with Fiona to say, that sounds like the sort of way a chief exec thinks, is they're not really satisfied with how things are and they want to make things better, and they care about the people they serve, the public they're there for, which was my motivation, I guess.
And not at all saying that finance directors don't care about their people, of course, in that statement. Just to put that on the record. But,
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
So real encouragement from Fiona to try something different, take on new responsibilities. Was there any kind of formal kind of training, formal support that they did that, other than you kind of learning how to do the job kind of part-time and then full-time after that?
I mean, I did a number of courses to help my development. I think Top Managers Program was probably, which is run by the King's Fund, which is the one that gave me the greatest insight into how I was behaving, how that impacted on how others experienced me, and therefore how they behaved, was, a really incredible program that opened my eyes in a way that no other. I mean, I've done a lot of leadership development courses, but they tend to focus quite much on the sort of academic theory of leadership, whereas the Top Managers Program is very much about who you are and what you represent. And so I found that, I would say, a very difficult course, but a very rewarding course. So that was probably the main thing. And then Fiona, as you say, coaching, development, and supporting me in the role.
Yeah. And presumably getting opportunities to do it part-time in that acting role, and then kind of getting the main role for the whole year. It's quite a nice kind of birth into doing that properly, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a great experience, actually, being able to take that journey, which each one was a bite-sized chunk properly in its own right. And certainly, when I was sort of deputy chief exec, but 2 days a week, Fiona was at Frimley, I got a real chance in quite a safe way to understand why being a chief exec is so challenging, but with someone that I could pick up the phone to. And I can't deny I don't still pick up the phone to Fiona and go, oh my goodness, what might be the right response in this particular situation?
And we all need that, don't we? Whether it's your predecessor or someone else to kind of check things out. So, yeah. So when you think about the organization, Graham, so you've been there as an executive since 2015. So you've done nearly 10 years there. So you've been part of the culture and how things are done. And one of the reasons we're talking is because of historic good staff results from your survey, best in class or joint best in class for 3 areas. We are a team, staff engagement, and we are always learning. So those 3 stand out from the 22-23 survey results. When you think about those areas, how has that been achieved? Because there must have been a lot of work that goes into ensuring that staff are valued in that way.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I'd say is one of the things that really appealed to me about Surrey and Borders when I first got to know the organisation is that sense of kindness, wanting to value everyone's work, wanting to hear why things were how they were, was already present in the organisation. So it was one of the things that attracted me to the organisation. And I suspect it continues to this day that is people's experience of the organisation. And so people who are interested in working in those sort of organisations will tend to join us and stay with us. And I think that's a really important aspect of continuing to promote culture.
And was there something on that then that created that inclusive, you've talked about inquisitive kind, that's not always the case in organizational cultures, as we all know. So do you know how that came about in Surrey and Borders?
I think that was, I mean, Fiona brought together Surrey and Borders from 3 distinct mental health trusts, and I think that was always part of her ethos of the organisation she wanted to create. And I think, you know, we always say, isn't it, you know, that how a leader behaves resonates through the organisation. So I think we've always kind of tried to be a curious organisation, and I've wanted to perpetuate that way of working. One of the things I talk about, I try and do as many inductions as I can, and one of the things I'd always talk about in induction is that if we really want to deliver the very best services, we need to make it okay to get things wrong, and we need to allow that sort of that sense of everything not being perfect every time to live and breathe, because otherwise no one's going to want to experiment, because the jeopardy involved with experimentation would mean that if it's not okay to get things wrong, then you'll never try anything new, you'll never improve. And I think that's always been in the organization, that sort of sense of we've got to be kind to each other. We've got to recognize that no one gets up and comes into work and thinks, I wonder how I can make life really difficult for XYZ today. That's not in anyone's mindset. So everyone comes in to try and do a good job. Often we've unconsciously created systems of work that make it really difficult to do a good job. And that, I think, that pervades through the organization, that mindset, and that's what creates the culture that we have.
And an observation from you about how hard that is, though, within a mental health perspective, because you know, when we think about mental health, we think about risk mitigation, we think about avoiding harm, don't we? We think about all the statutory responsibilities, and sometimes it can be the polar opposite of what you just described, which is a culture of trying things, and you know, if it fails, it fails. But the consequence of failure sometimes is quite huge, isn't it? So how have you got that right within the kind of nature of services that you provide?
Yeah, and there's a book, I can't remember its title. It's called something like Fantastic Mistakes or Great Mistakes. And it was a really interesting book because it was talking about, well, what role do mistakes play in the role of innovation and learning? And it was talking then about, you know, you obviously, the sort of mistake you want to avoid is the one that has a really big impact on someone's life, if you like, and was actually kind of observable. And the sort of in mistake you want to encourage is the one that unlocks a huge amount of learning where the downside is actually quite low, and therefore drives innovation onwards. And I think that's what I think the art of it is to get this right, is you have to get that dynamic right. So obviously we need to keep people safe, and as you say, mental health is very challenging in the sense of when we get that wrong, the consequences can be really tragic, and so it's really important we get that right. But we need to help people on their recovery journey is one of the things we talk about a lot at Surrey and Borders. And the recovery journey at some point has to have you stepping out on your own to learn about who you can be, to live the life that you want to live as the person we're supporting. And there is some inherent risk in that, and we need to work out how we can take those risks as safely as we can, but not removing all risk, because if you remove all risk, then you won't be able to to walk with people on their recovery journey. So we try and find that balance between the two things. And I absolutely think you're right that it's so easy to get the balance wrong, and you become overly controlling. And actually, in your pursuit of control, you actually lose the purpose. So if you like, you hit the target but miss the point.
And
So
that's
that's something that's very
that's a lovely linkage, isn't it, between the purpose, the raison d'etre of the organization, helping people to recover, which is in itself risky, and trying to get people to take more risk, and saying, therefore, as an organization, as a service, as professionals, that's our role, is to support that risk. I guess those two things very much chime together, don't they?
They do, absolutely, and helping our clinicians to feel confident about those decisions is a really important part of what we do. And we're constantly trying to think about different ways of doing things, and and the least restrictive ways of doing it, and recognizing that there is risk in it, but there is risk. I think we talk a lot now, don't we, just to sort of about the harm, say, in a hospital, and this idea that a hospital is really safe and the community is really unsafe is actually, I think, a miscategorization of what's going on. So allowing our clinicians to talk about the fact that actually, when you're in hospital, you're in such a controlled environment that you're not living the best life you can live. It's safe through one lens, absolutely. When you live in the community, you have a completely different profile, and allowing our clinicians to feel confident about promoting why living in the community is going to be the right thing for this person is a really important part of the culture of our organization and our leadership. So yes, I think the two absolutely come together.
Yeah. And that's really fascinating. And I guess it'd be good to hear a little bit more about the type of culture and leadership you therefore have created in the organization to kind of live out that ethos. You talked about you going and being visible and being heard and them hearing directly from you, but I bet there's lots of other things that go on an ongoing basis that creates that culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back to the way I think I respond and the way the senior executives respond impacts how everyone behaves, because I think most of us respond to our manager. So if I come down, if say something happens, I'm not interested in why it's happened. I'm just, well, that's got to not happen again, and this is intolerable. Then I am telling my direct reports that's how they should respond in difficult situations, and then that will just multiply through the organization. So we try and spend a lot of time thinking, as I say, about why people are behaving how they're behaving, and therefore you get that reverberating around the organization. So we had by way of example, we had a very sad situation, which I won't talk about the details of why it was sad, but of a healthcare worker who hadn't done what they were supposed to do. And the first response that some people gave was, well, that healthcare worker, that's really poor. It should have been really clear. They should have done this thing, which they didn't do. And we sort of started to sort of mull over and say, but why? I mean, they knew the jeopardy involved in not doing this thing. They wouldn't have just not done it for no reason. And as we dug into it a bit more, it found out that this person had been asked to do something else immediately as they were about to do the thing that was important that they were supposed to do. And they'd got, in that moment, someone important and said, can you go and do this? And they'd thought, oh, I must go and do that. And in that moment, it seemed the logical thing to do. And so really the fault there wasn't that they didn't do that. It's, well, why did we ask them to not do the thing we wanted them to do? And then you come back a level and you talk to that person and actually, well, they didn't do it because they thought, I don't want the healthcare worker to do the thing they're supposed to do. They could see a different problem that needed resolving. And you end up finding that you've got a systemic problem. And in this particular situation, it was that observing people and taking people to lunch were effectively due to happen at the same time by the same person, which is clearly impossible. And it's that behavior. It's actually us as a leadership team, all the way down, all taking that curious view to say, okay, so the answer then is not why did the individual behave in that way, but what conditions did we create that led the individual to seeing that they had no alternative but to do what they ended up doing, and then reworking how you work. But that is a leadership, that is a cultural approach to dealing with an incident or dealing with improvement. And I think that's what we're trying to work through our whole, and in everything we do, we try and ask ourselves those questions. And I think that's what promotes that culture.
Mm. And it's great to hear, because understanding the human dynamics and the human factors around that individual rather than going to blame is great to hear. But it takes some strong leaders to be able to do that, because isn't it always just so much easier to wrap it and finish datics off and say it was their fault and blah, 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 blah. But actually to do what you've just described actually means we've got to unpack a whole bunch of things about, are we working in the right way? And this is the problems just manifested in one mistake, hasn't it?
That's exactly right. And it's about,
And
seeing.
how have you built your leaders to be able to take that, because that doesn't revolve around you or the execs, that revolves around everybody operating like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then there's things we've done in the formal space and the things we've done in the informal space. So in the formal space, we've spent a lot of time actually investing in leadership development. So managers have a chance to go on leadership development, senior clinicians. So we have a consultants development pack as well. So we try and take people through in the formal learning process, this idea of what is leadership. Leadership isn't positional authority. Leadership is situational. Anyone can be a leader in a moment, given a particular context. So we try and take people, all our managers go through that, if you like, that formal training piece. And then we do a lot of QI, quality improvement, as a methodology, as a mindset, which I think also takes you into this space of why is the system designed. Every system's perfectly designed to deliver the outcome it delivers. So if you don't like the outcome, you've unconsciously designed the wrong system. We spend a lot of time sort of going through the formal training associated with that, helping people through those sort of tool packs that are in there, work out how they can think their way through the problem. And then, so that's the formal bit, and then you bring onto that the informal bit, which is about culture and values, how we behave to each other, what rhetoric we send to the organization. And I think that is what is done from manager to employee, from senior to clinician, if you like. And we spend the time in paying attention to those culture and values, and through our communication, whether that's our weekly sort of bulletin that's going out, I write in that, we do other communications from senior, because we're trying to keep promoting that this is our culture.
So there's a constant feed of inputs to make that culture real and live, it sounds like. And how then, as a senior team, do you sustain that? Because that it's just like any living issue, isn't it? It needs feeding, it needs amending, it needs correcting, it needs all of those things. So how do you do that as a team?
So I think it's one of those things, what's that phrase, isn't it? You can go fast on your own, but to go a long way, you need to go together, or something like that. And to go together takes more time. That's fundamentally my view. So I think there is a lot of effort in it, and you have to value it, because otherwise you wouldn't put the effort in. But you also need to create the conditions in which it can exist. And I think that does mean you have to sort of scroll back a bit, if you like, on pace, to recognize that if you tell everyone everything needs to be done really, really quickly, then you basically push out that way of working. It can't exist in that really sort of high pressure, everything needs to be done yesterday environment. So you have to create a different set of conditions when you say, let's be really, really clear about what must happen quickly. And then when the things that don't fall into that kind of quadrant, that are important and can have more reflective space, let's make sure we give them the space to exist, so that culture can exist. And then that way you don't ask people to do Herculean tasks, because I think if it does take a lot of effort. So if you think everything has to be done quickly and it takes all that effort, then you're just kind of driving your whole leadership and staff into the ground, if you like, because no one can exist with that burden on them.
Yeah, I get that. And thinking about you then, and you said a few things about what you do, but what's your personal impact on the organization, or how do you like your personal impact to be on the organization?
Yeah, I think I like to think, or what I'm trying to achieve in the organization is that balance between curiosity and action. So I think too much curiosity and nothing happens, and if you're too quick to act, or who was it said, for every complex problem there's a simple solution that's plain wrong. is how do we get that balance? And that's what I'm always trying to do. So I think as a leader, sometimes you're pushing your team to take more action, to be more directive, to say, you've said it's urgent, but it's been a period of time and we've not done anything. So then you're kind of pushing at the urgency dimension, and then you might equally push at the curiosity and working together and saying, well, are we talking to these people? How have we related to this? What's the learning process? Where's the reflective space for it? So I think that's what I'm trying to achieve, is kind of trying to achieve that balance across the whole organization. I try and get to know things. So I do a couple of shifts every year as a healthcare assistant, because I think it's really helpful to kind of take yourself out of your role and see your organization through a different lens. And I think by doing that, I always love the look when you're sitting on your break in the staff restroom and a random member of staff goes, aren't you the chief exec?
And it probably, no doubt, buys you a lot of latitude from people. It's like, well, at least he's trying, to understand that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think then you show you care about what, staff are doing on the front line. And then people, I think that changes the culture, because then everyone recognizes we're all trying to understand each other's role. And if I'm able to do that, then we're all able to do that. And that all and I think you get some fantastic views from staff, whether it's the person who's running the catering, or, to the nurse or the doctor, about what's going on in the organization. I do think sometimes there's a danger that senior leaders you can get into this space of the answers have to come from the senior leaders. And I don't think that's true. I think the answers actually often lie with the people who are closest to the work. But how do we create the apparatus where those answers that they instinctively know can get kind of codified, if you like, into a way of working for the organization? That's a much trickier proposition. And I guess that's what I feel my work is to understand what's really going on in the organization and create the space for that to lead to improvement work.
And make that everywhere, given that you're covering Surrey, and then you're going across into, I think, still Hampshire as well. Do you
North
as well?
East Hampshire,
So you've got a big stretch to cover and make sure everybody does the same. So then, thinking about you, how do you ensure that you can sustain the performance and culture in the organization? I mean, you talked earlier about still kind of running things past Fiona, your past chief executive, but how do you manage that? Because from experience and from conversation with others, sometimes the chief exec role can be quite lonely, can't it? You're by yourself. There are some things that just don't go beyond the chief executive. So how do you personally do that, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really obviously these are incredibly rewarding jobs, and one is very privileged to be the chief exec, would be my overriding view. But equally, they are difficult in the sense that, certainly my experience is there is nowhere to go. You are entrusted with the day-to-day running of the organization. You've appointed the executive team you want to have. You set the strategy with your board's support. So if things aren't happening, I think you kind of think, well, the only person who can make something different is me. And then things don't go as well as you'd hope. So then you're processing your own culpability. And I have to say, I think it feels very personal. It's almost visceral, I think, when something isn't what you want it to be in your organization. It's almost like a body blow. It's emotionally charged. I think as a chief exec, in a way I've never experienced, and as another senior leader, there's always someone else who you can, who could have played a role, should have played a role, which you don't have as chief exec. So you need to find a way of processing that, I think. And personally, I think some of that is, talking to former chief execs, talking to your fellow chief execs, sharing problems, talking with your executive team, and opening up. And I think actually opening up can feel really hard, but is really rewarding as the chief exec, because then I think sometimes you're judging yourself harsher than your colleagues are judging you. And so by opening up, you allow that doubt to exist, actually, and then in allowing the doubt to exist, it makes it easier to process what can be very difficult.
Yeah. And within that, and I think you said it's a great privilege to be the chief executive, but what kind of motivates you to keep on going and leading? Because you've done lots of impressive roles, and you've been a leader in this organization for quite some time at executive and now chief exec level. Why do you carry on doing it? If that
Yeah.
doesn't sound too negative.
No. Do you know what? I mean, I think the thing that really motivates me. So I did a shift in what's called a health-based place of safety. So that's where people say are on the street, they're very distressed, and the police will use the Mental Health Act to bring them to a place of safety because they're worried about either themselves or the public. And I was listening in on this person's Mental Health Act assessment, and he was talking through all the challenges in his life. And I sat there thinking to myself, this is why I do this job, because when we get it right, I know we can transform this young man's life. And I can absolutely see there is a really fantastic life he can lead with the right support from the NHS and social care. And just the ability to make one difference to one person's life pays back 1,000 times over in terms of making me spring out of bed, making me want to do the job, and making me, not worried about all the, we're in this very difficult situation at the moment in the NHS, aren't we, where I think most trusts are really struggling to match finance, quality, demand, and it can feel like an impossible solution sometimes. And then I recall those sort of events and think, but however impossible it might feel, it's a job we have to do, because when we get it right, we get it so right, and it's transformative to those people. And it's something that keeps me motivated absolutely every day.
And earlier you talked about coming into the NHS from the charity sector, and I think I heard you say it was a difficult transition. It took some time to do. So when you think about an individual out there listening to this podcast who may be in retail, maybe in aviation, or maybe in charity sector, thinking I'd love to be a leader in NHS, what would you advise them to do? How would you advise them to go about preparing themselves?
So I think there's a couple of things. So firstly, when you're trying to change sector, it is always really difficult because people will instinctively trust experience in the relevant sector. So somehow you've got to convey that you really are passionate about that move and that you've done your homework to understand it. So that was certainly what I did. I built up a LinkedIn references to other people. I went to the right conferences. I actively sought connections into the NHS. I went for a couple of jobs I didn't get, but that was all part of the learning experience for me. The second thing I'd say is that when you get the job, I found the language of the NHS to be nigh on impenetrable.
It still is.
Yeah. I remember.
I still, after all these years, stop people talking because even I don't understand some of the acronyms. Like, what are you talking about? And I don't make myself popular, but you have to do it, don't you?
We do. We do love acronyms, and we also describe things in incredibly complicated ways. It's really interesting, also non-elective stays or non-elective care. We use a negative to describe care in an emergency scenario, and there's countless. And sometimes I read the complaints and I think I don't even know how to pronounce the names of these drugs, let alone understand what they mean. But you have to get over that barrier, I think. And I remember sitting in meetings and literally writing down acronyms, thinking afterwards, I'm just going to have to Google these things to find out what on earth they are. There's a whole language to be learned, and it is difficult. And the NHS I would say is incredibly complicated. I think actually commercial is much simpler. Profit motive, really, really much more straightforward. Buy it cheap, sell it expensive, give the customer a good experience. You've got a successful business. NHS, way more complicated. What I do affects what someone else does. How they work impacts on me. Developing value, really difficult. Free at the point of contact, resources constrained, all really, really complicated. And complex. So I think it's just being willing to stick at it, because actually the value comes in, as I said, what we're doing for the public, and perseverance will get you there.
Well, Graham, it's been fabulous hearing your insights. Finance director, moving into the NHS, hearing a lovely description of your organization as curious, inquisitive, kind. What a lovely way to describe what you do. And that thing about the conversation we had about how to support people to make mistakes, and that kind of absolute linkage to, we're working with individuals that need to recover, and we need to help people recover and take those risks, is really very important for all types of NHS organizations. And your insights into how to create great culture and behavior, and also find the way into NHS leadership is really heartening to hear. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much for leading the organization, and clearly just doing a fabulous job that your staff love working there, which is great to hear. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you very much.